Hello and welcome back. My name is Adrian and I happen to read a lot, and January is over. January is over. It is done. We never have to think about January 2025 anymore. That is insane. I'm filming this on the 1st of February. I'm going to Dublin, so I'm filming a couple in a row to cover my Dublin trip. But today we are focusing on the books that I have read in January of 2025, and it was a solid month. Like, it was a really good start to the year. I pretty much loved nearly every single book that I read in January. I rarely DNF and I rarely have low ratings because I tend to know what I like and pick books that I just know I'll enjoy. So you'll rarely see me read 1-star books, rarely see me read 2-star books. If anything, I DNF a lot, but again, because I have now found books that I know I'll like based on like themes and genre and gimmicks and things like that, the DNF will just purely be writing style issues rather than, oh, I picked this book up and I wasn't sure I was going to like it and I did, because I feel like I know my taste now. But let's jump into these. We are going to go from lowest rating to highest rating, leave the best till last. Let's jump into it. So ironically, despite saying I rarely DNF, we do have one DNF this month, which was the first book in my 25 books in 2025, and that is The Foxhole Court. Now I'm going to completely contradict what I said in my intro. I picked this up on a whim because a friend of mine recommended it. Sorry, Morgan. They did text me when I said that I DNF'd it, and they were like, what? I started off really enjoying it. It follows a young guy called Neil who joins this university Exie team. Exie is a made-up sport in this series that's just basically more violent lacrosse. And despite being on the run, I don't really get it. He signs up to this uni's Exie team, and I only got halfway through before I DNF'd it. It was seeming okay. Like, it was one of those books where it read very much like fan fiction, which I don't normally mind when I'm reading fan fiction. And it felt a bit fan fiction-y. The dialogue was quite cringy. The characters were so unbelievably written. Like, I don't believe these people are real. And I like realism in my contemporary stories. If it's set in a contemporary time, I want to feel some kind of realism to some extent, and I didn't feel that with any of them, to be honest. But yeah, so I gave it a go, and at first like, oh, this is kind of different, it's kind of fun. And then I got halfway through and they were all just kind of shouting and arguing with each other and being like really just hostile, and I know that's the point, but I didn't care, and I just sat there and went, I can't read another 100 and plus pages of this anymore, so I DNF'd it. Sorry, I really want to be part of the Foxhole Court community, but I will not be. It was not that great. Then we have Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu. I will be honest, I read another book this month that was absolutely incredible, that was inspired by Carmilla, that I knew in my soul, I've got to read this because I loved that book so much, and I'll mention it later because it's higher on the list. And I was like, cool, I want to read the original source material. I want to see what inspired this book. I also watched Nosferatu. I was like, I want to read more vampire books in my life. So I read Carmilla. I bought it for really cheap on my Kindle. I was like, let's go, let's read it. And I disappointed many people. If you follow me on Instagram, I do on my stories, like I'll just, when I finish a book, I'll put the book up and give it a star rating. I had 3 people message me. 3 people saying, what the fuck? How could you give this 2 stars? And I'll be honest with you, it was boring. It was boring. I'm sorry. The writing stuff for me, I loved the idea. It was very much a case of a brilliant idea, lacking execution. I love an info dump, but that was just all one 110-page info dump. The pacing was all over the place. Sometimes the paragraphs would flow super easily, and then I'd feel like I was wading through mud. The pacing, abhorrent. Sorry, I didn't love the pacing. I felt that the structure, everything was underwhelming. The characters were not that engaging. I found none of the characters, again, everything just felt super unbelievable, and not in a way which is like, oh, this is a fantasy element, this is a vampire character, of course it's going to be unbelievable. No, I didn't like the dialogue. Carmilla's dialogue, I was just like eye-rolly. and I'm really sorry. I really wanted to like it desperately, and it just didn't work for me. So then we have Berserk Volume 1. This was a 3.5-star rating for me. I have a friend called Jonathan who loves the Berserk manga. The Berserk manga is probably his favourite manga of all time, and he's spoken about it over the 3+ years of our friendship. And I thought, do you know what? I'm going to bloody give it a go. And I requested it on my library app beginning of December, and then I read it 2 days before January finished. I was waiting a really, really long time for that book, but I read it, didn't hate it. It wasn't the best thing I've ever read. I always say whenever I read manga that the first volume needs to hit as hard as the Promised Neverland first volume hits. If it doesn't hit like that, I rarely continue it. So it had kind of the shock factor, and you do understand the main character Guts like a little bit. You get to know who he is on a surface level at the beginning. You don't know any of his backstory or anything, but you understand he is a very powerful mercenary, and you kind of get to explore a little bit of the monsters that he fights and the people that he fights and what a day-to-day experience is for him. I personally, in my manga volumes, like a bit more backstory. So I wanted to know a little bit what, even hints to what the overall plot of the first arc is going to be, or the overall plot of the series is going to be. And you got that in the last, 2 pages, which is probably why I was like, cool, I am going to continue. I want to see where this goes in volume 2. But overall, it was very much just like here's Guts, this is what his day-to-day life is, and he's going to meet a little elf, right? And it was good and it was fine. I just wanted more, and it left me a bit lacking. So it couldn't get higher than a 3.5. And I also, that art style is very hit and miss. Very hit and miss. Then we have The Warm Hands of Ghosts, which is another 3.5-star rating. This started off super strong. I have read Catherine Arden's Winter Night trilogy, and I love the Winter Night trilogy. This, even though I went into this book knowing it was more historical fiction with a bit of fantasy, and the fantasy element comes about halfway through, even going into that, I still struggled. I loved the beginning of this. The setup was amazing. I got about halfway through and I was really enjoying it. And then I got to the halfway through mark and I was just expecting more. I was expecting the story to up the ante, and it didn't really up the ante. And then by the time it did, I kind of my interest was waning. So I really loved the first half. And if you love World War stories, I do think you'll get a lot from this. I think if you're a hardcore sci-fi fantasy fan, probably not. But I did like the ending. I thought the ending was really, really realistic to the circumstances of the World War. And I did overall enjoy the ending. And I loved the first half. But yeah, that second half, just kind of my interest had waned. And I am also the person where if I put a book down and I take some time to pick it back up, my interest will never be as strong as it was when I was first reading it. I am the kind of person where if I put a book down just to give myself a break, I normally end up DNFing it. So the fact that I even finished it is saying something. So yeah, 3.5 star rating for The Warm Hands of Ghosts. I was kind of hoping for just a little bit more. So the next one is The Abandoners, which was my first non-fiction book of the year. This is a book that explores the way that as a society we view women that abandon their children, and we look at, as a society, how we view men who abandon their children compared to women, looking at notable female figures in history as well as movies and TV shows. It was a really, really good analysis of motherhood and kind of the expectations we put on mothers compared to fathers. So I really, really enjoyed it. Like with quite a lot of non-fiction, I kind of, again, this is probably just more of a signifier of who I am as a reader. I was really invested in the first half, really, really liked it. As I got to the last 50 pages, my interest started to wane a little bit. But overall, I loved the topic that the author was talking about, and I felt that the way that she regaled her own personal anecdotes alongside analysis was done really, really well. Then my final 3.5 star rating is Dream Girl Drama. 3.5 star ratings for me. I might have to do a video about my star ratings in general, but a 3.5 star rating, specifically a 3-star rating, is very like middle of the road. Like there was some equally good bits and equally bad bits. If I give you a 3.5, more good outweighed the bad, but you're still kind of middle of the road. Just for emphasis. Dream Girl Drama was a 3.5 stars for me. I had some issues with the beginning of this book. Loved most of it. Loved the ending. Loved the couple. Loved just all the whole world, the characters. I think the Big Shots series and the interconnected stories I just really, really like. I did think for a series that is named Big Shots as a sports romance, we are just doing hockey a lot. So I do know that she's bringing out a 4th one, which is also covering softball, not just hockey. Thank God, because I did think it was ironic for it to be a sports romance series, start with golf, and then the next 2 books, and even technically the 4th one, is all hockey based. My issue with Dream Girl Drama was the initial meeting of our 2 main characters. So the dynamic of the 2 main characters is that they meet at the very beginning of the book and they meet each other for a couple of hours. I would say 2 hours. And then they go their separate ways. They're thinking about each other. They go their separate ways. And they find out that their parents are getting married. And they're like, what the fuck? And then a lot of intense stuff happens in the first 40 pages that doesn't feel, and I know this is ironic to say, but it doesn't feel realistic. I just wanted the main couple, who make a lot of very drastic decisions after knowing each other for like 2 hours. If their meeting had lasted like 2 days, like a weekend, then I would have felt as a reader more convinced about their romance, because I did not feel convinced at all by any of their decisions at the very beginning of the book. And I think because you meet this couple in the au pair affair, because it's the 3rd in a series, I think the reader is expected to have read the first book and be like, oh, well, they already have a dynamic going, so then they don't have to do the heavy lifting in this book. That's kind of my impression. I want to say that I still fucking really enjoyed this book, and I'll be reading the 4th book, and I'll be reading anything that Tessa Bailey writes. I absolutely thoroughly enjoyed Dream Girl Drama, but because I struggled with that initial meeting, I was just a bit like, my thoughts on the beginning. But it's just the beginning, because everything else and the way she writes these characters is done so amazingly, but I couldn't get out the fact that they made all these big drastic changes over meeting someone for 2 hours. And maybe it's just because I'm not an Insta-Love fan, because I was like, they need a weekend for me to consider this to be believable. Moving on to the 4-star ratings now, and the first one is The Little Sparrow Murders by Seishi Yokomizo. This is the 6th book in the Detective Kosuke Kindaichi series, and this is a really good one. This is really good. At first, and if any of you have seen my vlogs, because I talk about my reading in my weekly vlogs, if you've seen the vlogs, you will know that at first, when I saw how many pages and how many characters were in this book, it was quite overwhelming to understand who was connected to who, and who was friends with who, and who was in what family. And a couple of the characters had 2 different names, and I was very overwhelmed by the cast of characters. It was just a bit too much. Once I kind of gauged that, I would say it took me about 50 to 60 pages to gauge it. Once I got the gist of like the dynamic, the book was so good. And the ending, this is the first time that I think, since the first book, this was the first time that Seishi Yokomizo has genuinely shocked me by the ending. And I love an ending that relies a lot on psychology. I think it's probably why I'm a Agatha Christie Hercule Poirot specific fan, because the little grey cells and the psychology is very important to him. The psychology behind the ending and the actions of characters is just incredible. And at first I read it and I was like, oh shit, okay, this is the choice, this is what he's going for. But then as it was explained, like my murder mystery loving brain was like, yes, this is the only way it could have been done. It makes so much sense. And there's so much tragedy in this book, which is just so genuinely devastating. But yeah, it's like the only slow-paced book that I stick with, because I'm not a massive fan of slow-paced books. Obviously, we're trying to change that this year, but this took me some time to get through. But the payoff at the end is just so worth it, even if I did have to spend 60 pages like flicking back and forth. But just so good. Seishi Yokomizo. So the next 4-star book, I actually cannot find my copy of it. It is somewhere in this house and she's missing. But that is Frieren Beyond Journey's End, Volume 6. There's not much really to say about Volume 6 apart from it was just a solid book. I really enjoyed it. There wasn't as much like character backstory or lore backstory as much as there have been in the previous volumes. There was a couple of little bits, but they felt more like set up for the rest of the series going forward than actual like established backstory, if that makes sense. Like they're hinting to backstory. This volume was very much just focusing on our current characters, Fern and Frieren, and their power and what kind of power they have. So it was very much like a present day volume, and my favourite volumes are always the ones that merge the parallels of Frieren's backstory to what's happening in the present day. Those are my favourite, but it was still a solid fucking volume. It's so good. But I am happy to say that I'm getting through the exam arc, and I have mentioned it. I don't think I've actually mentioned it. Well, I've mentioned it to my friends, but I'm over exam competition storylines. I don't want to see, really for me anymore, another book that's like a deadly competition. Don't want to do it. Can't do it anymore. It's not for me. So the fact that the exam arc is over and we're moving on to a different arc does make me happy. But I will say there is an amazing parallel at the end of this volume, and I just want to say Fern was getting her flowers at the end of this volume, and I was loving it because I love Fern so much. Again, if you've watched my vlogs, you know the journey that I went on with this book. City of Last Chances is a book that I brought over from 2024 for my book group, and I did not finish it first. I was like, this is going to be my first book of 2025, and then I read Dream Girl Drama in between because this was slow as hell. I read the first 100 pages and was struggling through this. I was like, I love the world. I really enjoy the characters, but this writing style is so slow paced. Got the audiobook on my library app. Game changer. Game changer. I will be listening to the second book on audiobook. I can't remember, and I'll put his name up here. I always forget. But the audiobook narrator did a phenomenal job. It took a book that I was adamant, do you know what, I'm probably going to end up DNFing, and turned it to a 4.5 rated book. Stunning, incredible. It made me appreciate the work a lot more. I think just the writing style, sorry to Adrian Tchaikovsky, the writing style was not for me. It was just incredibly slow paced. Loved the world, loved the characters, loved every chapter being told from a different point of view. I love stuff like that. The writing style, it's not even that I didn't like the style of the writing, it's just the pacing was so slow. But then you put it into an audiobook format, every moment that I got, I was listening to the audiobook. It was so incredibly good. And then another 4.5 rated book, we have Mockingjay by Suzanne Collins, which I also audiobooked. This. I would say, most of this book, because I really loved the audiobook narrator. Again, I'll find out who the audiobook narrator is and put her name somewhere. But I am reading this series one after the other each month in time for Sunrise on the Reaping, which actually comes out next month. So this is really exciting. I loved Catching Fire. Mockingjay was my least favourite movie. I would also say my least favourite book, but different in the way that Mockingjay, I just really struggled with Mockingjay the movie when I first watched it. I appreciated it more in a second rewatch before I watched Ballad. But I loved Mockingjay. It's just my least favourite of the three. I would say going into this, I really struggled at first with the shift of the way that the book changed from books 1 and 2. There's a massive tonal shift. There's a massive shift just in general in the vibes of Mockingjay. And I did struggle with that initially. I was like, I am not invested. I can't get myself secured in this story. Ironically, until Peter got mentioned. And then I was locked in. I loved the ending. The second half was so much more enjoyable for me than the first half. I think once they started, when Katniss decided to be the Mockingjay, that's when the book got more interesting for me. And while Katniss was understandably grieving and healing in some capacity. I think once it got back to the kind of Mockingjay, rebellion, cat and mouse game between Snow and Katniss, that is when my interest peaked. But what an amazing way to end a series and end a trilogy of books. Yes, I know Ballad is part of the universe, but Mockingjay is an incredible way to end Katniss's story. And I love the beauty of the ending. I don't care what people say. Katniss having babies, incredible ending. The only female character that I will gladly see have a slow domestic life away from the spotlight. She doesn't need her like intense bow and arrow powers anymore, which obviously aren't powers, but you know what I'm saying. I'm just so happy to see Katniss have this beautiful, quiet, slow life because she deserves it. And finally, my last book of January 2025. It was a very early January 2025 book. Again, if you've watched the vlogs, you will know I spoke about it. I read this book in 2 days. I read half of it on day 1 and the other half on day 2. Incredible. This is the reason I read Carmilla, which wasn't incredible. This is Hungerstone by Kat Dunn, which is a Carmilla retelling set during the Industrial Revolution. I love a woman going insane. And that is what this book has. The main character, Lenore, in this book is insane. I just couldn't put it down. I loved the characters. I loved Lenore and Carmilla's dynamic. I loved the way that the plot slowly developed in this creeping, tense atmosphere. The way that you really question every single character in this book. Even the characters where the author is explicitly saying to you, this character's nice, I don't know what you're talking about. As a reader, you're like, I don't trust you. Yeah, really, really good. Very intense, very atmospheric. Loved Carmilla's whole vibe. Carmilla in this compared to Carmilla in, well, I don't have my Kindle, but Carmilla, the ebook I read, different. Carmilla feels like a true mastermind, a true intellect in this, while Camilla in the original source material feels very like it's just power, it's just hunger. There is a sense of reservedness to Carmilla, where Camilla she's the cat in this situation. It's the cat and mouse game. She's the cat and she's smart, and I just loved it. Yeah, this was incredible. I want to read everything that Kat Dunn has written ever in the history of the world. Just an incredible, if you want a good sapphic historical vampire tale with a little bit of insanity, read this. Just perfectly plotted, incredible characters. And so that's it. Here we are. This is the final, it's a very not put together stack, but there you go. This is the final collection of books for January of 2025 that are going to go on the shelf. I'm very happy that we are now through January and everything is getting less depressing and dreary with the weather. But thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe and all that fun stuff. And yeah. I've also overextended myself for February, so I'm very nervous about that.